When I look back now, I can trace the beginning of everything to a silence that felt harmless at the time. My name is Ethan Hale, and for 4 years, I believed I understood love because I was loyal. I thought loyalty meant endurance, patience, and never asking for too much. Marcus Reed was my partner, confident and admired, the kind of man who filled rooms without trying. I convinced myself that standing quietly beside him was enough. I didn't realize how slowly I was disappearing until loneliness began feeling like a normal part of loving him. Marcus and I met during a crowded summer fundraiser downtown, where conversation was loud and emotions were louder. He had smiled at me like he already knew me, and I had fallen into that smile without resistance. In the beginning, he listened. He asked questions. He noticed when I changed my tone or grew quiet. Over time, those things faded, not dramatically, but gradually, like music lowering until you don't remember when it stopped. He still loved me, I think, but love became something assumed instead of practiced. Our life together looked stable from the outside. Shared apartment, shared routines, shared friends. But emotionally, we lived in different rooms. Marcus thrived socially. He had a large circle, people who admired his confidence and fed off his energy. I attended gatherings as his partner, smiling, nodding, present but unseen. Whenever I tried to explain how distant I felt, Marcus would laugh gently and say I was overthinking. I learned to swallow discomfort before it could become an argument. Silence became easier than being misunderstood again. When Marcus told me he needed to leave town for a weekend work commitment, he suggested I stay with his friends at a rented house by the lake. He said it casually, like a solved problem. "You'll have fun," he told me. "They love you." I agreed quickly, not because I wanted to go, but because I didn't want to seem insecure. Saying yes felt like proof that I was easy to love, uncomplicated, low maintenance. I packed my bag and ignored the unease sitting quietly in my chest. The house was warm and loud when we arrived. Laughter echoed through open windows, music played from someone's speaker, and conversations overlapped in comfortable familiarity. Everyone hugged Marcus, slapped his back, welcomed him like a centerpiece. I followed behind, smiling politely, absorbing introductions that vanished as quickly as they came. That was when I noticed Julian Cross standing slightly apart from the group, observing rather than performing. He smiled at me, not brightly, but sincerely, and it felt grounding in a way I couldn't explain yet. Julian didn't ask intrusive questions or try to impress me. He asked how the drive was, whether I liked coffee or tea, and waited for my answers without rushing me. We sat on the porch later, watching the sun dip low over the lake, saying very little. The quiet didn't feel awkward. It felt intentional. When Marcus joined us briefly, his attention drifted back to his phone almost immediately. Julian noticed. I noticed Julian noticing. Something about that unsettled me more than comforted me. That night, Marcus pulled me aside and kissed my forehead, apologizing again for leaving early the next morning. "I'll be back before you know it," he promised. I told him it was fine. I meant it in the way people mean things they haven't examined closely. When he left at dawn, the house felt different, lighter in noise, heavier in presence. I stood in the kitchen holding my coffee, unsure where I belonged now that the role of Marcus's partner had temporarily dissolved. Over the next day, I moved through conversations carefully, always aware of my place on the edge. Julian checked in occasionally, not hovering, just present. He offered me a chair when seats were scarce, asked if I wanted to take a walk later. None of it felt like flirtation. It felt like consideration. I caught myself relaxing around him, speaking without rehearsing my words first. That realization frightened me more than it should have. I reminded myself that kindness didn't mean anything more. Still, I noticed how often my eyes searched for Julian in a room. How his absence registered before his presence. I told myself it was coincidence, that I was projecting my loneliness onto the nearest available listener. Marcus called that evening, distracted, multitasking through our conversation. When we hung up, I felt heavier instead of reassured. Julian sat beside me afterward, saying nothing, just sharing the space. I didn't know it then, but something fragile inside me had already begun to shift. Marcus's absence stretched longer than I expected, not in hours but in emotional distance. The house settled into a slower rhythm, and without Marcus anchoring the energy, I felt exposed. I told myself it was temporary, that nothing meaningful could happen in a few quiet days. Still, I woke each morning aware of a growing restlessness, a feeling that something unresolved was waiting for me in the daylight. I tried to name it as boredom or fatigue, but the truth hovered just beneath those easier explanations. Julian and I began sharing more time without planning it. We gravitated toward the same corners of the house, the same moments of pause. It started with casual conversations over coffee, then longer walks by the lake where the water mirrored the sky too closely to ignore. He spoke carefully, choosing words as if they mattered, and I found myself doing the same. That alone felt intimate. With Marcus, I often edited myself down. With Julian, I felt invited to expand. One afternoon, Julian asked about my childhood. The question caught me off guard, not because it was invasive, but because it was rare. I told him about growing up learning how to stay agreeable, how love in my family was quiet and conditional. As I spoke, I realized how little of this Marcus knew. Julian listened without interrupting, without offering solutions. When I finished, he nodded slowly, like he was holding something fragile. "That explains a lot," he said gently, and I felt seen in a way that startled me. That I tried to restore balance by calling Marcus more often, but our conversations felt thinner. He was busy, distracted, always about to run into another obligation. When I hung up, guilt crept in immediately. I was measuring him against someone else, and that felt unfair. I told myself I was just responding to attention, not craving it. I reminded myself that relationships went through dry spells. None of those thoughts quieted the ache that followed me back to the porch where Julian was waiting. As the days passed, Julian shared pieces of himself too. He talked about relationships that never quite aligned, about being the person people leaned on but rarely chose. There was no bitterness in his voice, just resignation. I recognized that tone. It mirrored my own more closely than I wanted to admit. We laughed sometimes, softly, as if loud laughter might break the spell of honesty we were building. Each conversation layered meaning onto the last, until it felt like we were continuing something already begun. One evening, a storm rolled in unexpectedly. The others retreated indoors, but Julian and I stayed outside under the covered deck, listening to rain strike wood and water. The air felt charged, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with proximity. Julian told me he admired how loyal I was to Marcus. The word landed heavily. I didn't know whether it was praise or warning. I told him loyalty was easier than people thought when you were afraid of being alone. That confession opened something I couldn't close. Julian didn't step closer, but his presence felt nearer all the same. He said quietly that emotional neglect could feel lonelier than solitude. I felt the truth of that sentence settle into my chest. I wanted to argue, to defend Marcus, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stared out at the lake, watching ripples form and vanish. I realized I had stopped protecting the relationship in my thoughts, and that frightened me more than desire ever could. Later that night, I lay awake replaying every word we'd shared. I told myself nothing inappropriate had happened, that honesty wasn't betrayal. Yet my heart raced with a sense of secrecy. I was carrying something I hadn't earned the right to carry. The next morning, Julian was quieter, more reserved, and the shift confirmed what I had been denying. We both knew we were standing near a line neither of us had meant to approach. The moment it finally broke wasn't dramatic. We were alone in the kitchen, sunlight spilling across the counter. Julian said my name, slowly, and told me that what he felt wasn't simple friendship anymore. He didn't touch me. He didn't ask for anything. He just spoke the truth. I felt my chest tighten, not with shock, but recognition. I didn't say the words aloud, but in that silence, I accepted them. In doing so, I crossed a boundary I could never uncross. After that morning, nothing returned to its previous shape. The house felt smaller, the air heavier, as if walls had absorbed our unspoken admission and were holding it against us. Julian and I moved carefully around each other, polite but distant, each pause thick with everything we refused to say out loud. I told myself the restraint mattered, that pulling back meant I was still choosing the right thing. But restraint didn't erase what had already taken root inside me. It only made it ache more quietly. Marcus came back that evening. I heard his voice before I saw him, loud and familiar, filling the space the way it always had. He kissed me, asked if I'd had fun, and I said yes because it was easier than explaining the complicated truth. He didn't notice how tense my shoulders were, how my answers came half a second too late. Or maybe he noticed and chose not to ask. Either way, the distance between us no longer felt neutral. It felt earned. That night, lying beside Marcus, I stared at the ceiling and felt a weight settle in my chest. Guilt pressed down, not because of what I had done, but because of what I felt. I had given something away without meaning to, something I couldn't retrieve. Marcus reached for me in his sleep, his hand resting over my arm, familiar and grounding. Instead of comfort, I felt panic. I wondered when his touch had started feeling like an obligation instead of an anchor. Julian avoided me the next day. When our eyes met across the room, he looked away first. The distance hurt more than closeness would have. I realized then that emotional betrayal didn't require secrecy forever, sometimes it announced itself through loss. I felt pulled in opposite directions, wanting to protect my relationship and mourning something that had never fully existed. That contradiction hollowed me out. Marcus grew quieter as the weekend ended. He asked fewer questions, watched me more closely. One evening, as we packed to leave, he asked if something had happened while he was gone. The question wasn't accusatory. It was tired. I opened my mouth to deny it, then closed it again. Lying felt heavier than the truth, but the truth felt too large to explain without causing irreversible damage. I told him I felt lonely sometimes. I told him I didn't know how to ask for more without sounding ungrateful. It wasn't a full confession, but it was honest enough to hurt. Marcus listened in silence. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but distant. He said he hadn't realized how far apart we'd grown. He said he thought stability meant we were okay. There was no anger, just sadness, and that made everything worse. I realized then that neglect wasn't intentional, it was habitual. Still, habits could break people just as easily as cruelty. That we left the lake house with unspoken goodbyes. Julian stood on the porch as we drove away, his expression unreadable. I didn't look back again. In the weeks that followed, the weight of everything pressed harder. Marcus tried, in his way, to be more present, but something essential had shifted. I found myself withdrawing, afraid that any closeness would feel dishonest. Julian never reached out. I didn't either. Silence became the consequence we both accepted. Eventually, Marcus and I had the conversation neither of us had been brave enough to start earlier. We admitted we were holding on to a version of us that no longer fit. There were tears, but no shouting. Love didn't vanish, it just stopped being enough. We separated quietly, with more grief than anger, carrying the knowledge that neither of us was entirely to blame. That I think about Julian sometimes, about how briefly he saw me more clearly than I saw myself. What happened between us never became a story I could explain easily, but it changed me. It taught me that emotional honesty delayed too long can become a form of betrayal. Now, when I'm alone, I don't confuse silence with peace. I know the difference, and I live with it.